There is something that we all at some point have felt, the presence of the self. This self seems so natural, such a part of our being, that we often forget to question it. But what exactly is this self? When we ask ourselves, who am I? What are we really trying to understand? The answer to this question is not simple, nor immediate. It cannot be found in ready-made words or easy answers. It requires a journey that goes beyond thoughts and emotions, beyond the identity we have built over the years, a journey that leads us to question our own perception of reality and, more importantly, our essence. The self that we all recognize, the one that defines us, moves us, and relates us to the world around us, seems to be something solid, something unquestionable. But if we look closer, if we look deeper, does this self really exist the way we think it does? At this point, some of you might be asking, but why question something so fundamental? Why question who we are when we all already have a clear idea of that? The truth is that this self with which we identify is so ingrained in us that we never even think to question it. But when we begin to question it, something extraordinary happens. We may discover that the self we think we are is not as fixed as we imagined, and what lies behind this self may be infinitely deeper and freer than we could ever have conceived. Have you ever stopped to observe the constant flow of thoughts that happens in your mind? How one thought arises, another follows, and so on, without you noticing that there is continuity between them. These thoughts are often about who you are, what you like, what you desire, what you did in the past. But what is this self that appears in all of these thoughts? How is it formed? What you believe to be you is actually a narrative constructed by your mind. From the moment we begin to form memories and experiences, the mind starts creating a story about who we are, about what we think, and about what we feel. But if we look more closely, we can begin to perceive that this self that the mind has constructed is nothing more than a set of thoughts, emotions, and images that interconnect and succeed one another over time. They are essentially like chapters in a book, but without a fixed author or clear direction. It is a flow of thoughts and feelings that intertwine, a story that the mind tells itself. But if you stop to observe, there is no central self behind it. What exists, in fact, is constant change, a succession of thoughts, emotions, and perceptions that follow one another, but never remain fixed. With each new experience, we add another layer to the story of the self. If you stop and reflect, you will realize that, depending on the moment, the self changes. You may feel confident at one moment and at another, insecure or anxious. These feelings, these thoughts, construct the identity you have of yourself. That is why the self is an illusion. It is just a mental construction, something the mind creates to make sense of the experience of being. All of this to create continuity, a continuous self, always adapting to the circumstances of the moment. But if the self is merely a creation of the mind, a temporary construction that arises and disappears over time, what remains? What are we really when we are not so involved with this identity, with this story the mind tells about who we are? This is the turning point. When we begin to question the solidity of the self, we start to open space for a new understanding of ourselves. And by doing this, we begin to realize that the self, as a work of the mind in constant construction, only exists as long as we believe in it. We are not the identity that the mind creates. What we truly are goes beyond the emotions and thoughts that arise in our everyday experience. The true self is not what we think we are, but the consciousness that observes all of this. This consciousness, immutable and pure, is the foundation of our experience, the field where all thoughts, feelings, and perceptions arise and disappear. When we speak of consciousness, we are referring to something much broader than the common perception of ourselves, as consciousness is not something limited to the body or the mind. Pure consciousness is the space where everything happens, but it is not affected itself. It is not a thought nor a feeling. It is the witness that observes everything, but without getting involved. Throughout the day, we are constantly involved in a flood of thoughts, emotions, and experiences. However, these phenomena are not us. They arise and dissipate, but there is something within us that remains unchanged, always present, the consciousness that observes all of this. Imagine for a moment that you are feeling a strong emotion like anger or sadness. Now, try to take a step back and ask yourself, who is observing this emotion? The answer is not anger nor sadness. What observes these emotions is you, but not the self that defines itself by them. You are the consciousness that is aware of anger or sadness, but without becoming one with them. When we experience moments like this of frustration, anger, or sadness, for example, thoughts like, "This isn't right," or "I shouldn't be feeling this way," begin to dominate the mind. In moments like these, try to step back a little and simply observe these thoughts and feelings. Notice that even though they arise intensely, you are not the frustration, nor the thoughts that accompany it. You are the consciousness that observes them. The frustration comes and goes, but the observer remains. This is the role of the witness of consciousness, a pure presence that observes but does not engage. It simply is aware of everything that happens, but without creating a bond with the content of the experience. When we identify with our thoughts or emotions, we believe we are that. But true freedom comes when we realize that we are the immutable consciousness that observes, and not the thoughts or emotions. If we observe our own thoughts, we will realize how they come and go without us needing to do anything. We don't need to control thoughts or cling to them. We just observe them. Just as the sky observes the clouds passing, you observe your thoughts and emotions, but without identifying with them. They arise and disappear, but you, the consciousness, remain unchanged. This pure consciousness is the unchanging field where all experiences happen. It is not affected by mood changes or fluctuations in thoughts. It simply observes the flow of life without attachment, without reacting. So, while thoughts and emotions come and go, we are the immutable witness. We are the consciousness that observes everything with serenity, untouched by the changes happening around us. This understanding is deeply liberating, as it frees us from the need to identify with the narrative of the mind and connects us with what we truly are. This role of the witness is crucial for us to understand our true nature. The witness does not identify with the content of the experience, but only with the fact that it is happening. It is not affected by joy or sadness, pleasure or pain, because it is not the thought nor the emotion. It is simply the presence that observes these moments. No matter how intense the experiences that arise in the mind, consciousness always remains in its unchanging state, witnessing everything, but not touched by anything. This understanding is transformative because it allows us to separate who we are from what we are experiencing. When we recognize that we are the consciousness that observes, we begin to understand that regardless of the fluctuations of the mind, our true nature is deep, stable, and serene. It is precisely when we question who is thinking or feeling that we begin to perceive a subtle yet essential distance between the observer, the consciousness, and what is being observed, thoughts and emotions. But it's important to understand that this questioning doesn't mean denying the existence of emotions or thoughts. They are real as momentary experiences. However, the central point is to understand that these experiences do not define your essence. Questions like, who is thinking this? Who is feeling this? Bring clarity to the mind, and this helps us realize that behind these passing experiences, There is a permanent consciousness, a witness that is always present. When you question in this way, you place yourself beyond the fluctuations of the ego. You stop being automatically dragged by the stories the mind creates and begin to recognize a silent and peaceful space within yourself, a space that observes everything without judgment or attachment. It is in this space that true wisdom is found, because in it you realize that thoughts do not need to govern your actions, nor do your emotions need to control your reactions. You begin to become a conscious observer, and consequently you gain much greater emotional autonomy. To make this concept clear, let's look at a practical example. Imagine you are facing a situation that generates anxiety. The mind starts creating an endless stream of thoughts. What if something goes wrong? What if I can't do it? How will I deal with the consequences? Normally, these thoughts immediately produce a growing sense of concern. But instead of just reacting to them, try to briefly interrupt this flow and calmly ask yourself, who is noticing these anxious thoughts right now? Who is feeling this anxiety? This brief pause creates a fundamental shift in your perception. By questioning the identity of the observer, you realize there is a space between you and the anxious thoughts. You are not the anxiety, nor the agitated mind that produces these thoughts. You are, essentially, the calm and immutable consciousness that observes all of this happening. In this moment of realization, anxiety starts to lose its power over you because it no longer defines who you are. You continue feeling it, but now as a passing phenomenon within your consciousness, not as the consciousness itself. This constant process of questioning has a powerful cumulative effect. Each time you practice it, you strengthen your ability not to immediately identify with mental content, and with that, you start recognizing yourself as the silent and conscious space, the attentive witness that remains undisturbed by mental fluctuations. This is how the questioning of who is observing becomes a practical, direct, and profoundly transformative tool. It's not just about reflecting, but about practicing daily, bringing results and clarity. The more you question, the more you discover your true essence as pure consciousness, and the more deeply you experience a life marked by tranquility, wisdom, and inner balance. When we begin to look more closely at our own experience, we realize that the self, being constructed by the mind, is like a mask we wear to interact with the world around us. This is where the ego comes in. The ego emerges as a fluid narrative shaped by external circumstances and internal perceptions. Once again, there is no immutable identity, but a series of temporary roles, adaptable to each moment. And as situations change, the ego also adjusts, adapts, and reinvents itself. This identity created by the mind is formed from our stories, beliefs, emotions, and lived experiences. It is not static, but constantly reinvents itself as the situations we experience evolve. The ego creates a version of ourselves based on what we believe we are, the roles we play, and the stories we tell about ourselves. Depending on the environment, the ego may present itself as the winner, the sufferer, the leader, or the failure, for it is, in essence, a flexible identity that adjusts to external expectations. All of this results from a succession of identities that emerge and disappear, based on the flow of experiences and the interpretations we give them. But when we begin to question these identifications, we realize the fragility of the ego and its dependence on external circumstances. The ego hides behind our personal stories and limitations, creating a sense of solid identity. But when observed closely, it reveals its true nature, a temporary mental construction. But when we focus on pure consciousness, the one that observes all thoughts and feelings without engaging, we begin to realize that we are not the ego's character. We are not the winner or the loser. We are the consciousness that observes these temporary, mutable identities. And when we connect with this state of observation, identification with the ego begins to dissipate, and we start to realize that the true essence of the self is not found in any role or identity created by the mind, but in the pure consciousness that observes. This dissolution of the ego is a continuous process, but as we distance ourselves from temporary identifications and begin to focus on pure consciousness, the feeling of freedom intensifies. The ego loses control and we begin to live more authentically, free from the limitations of a fixed and reactive self. What remains is the silent presence of consciousness, immutable beyond all thoughts, feelings, and stories. When we reach the point of realizing that the self we identify with is nothing more than an illusion, something extraordinary begins to happen. We experience a profound liberation. The self, with its stories, roles, and identities, begins to dissolve, giving way to the deepest truth of who we really are. We realize that we are no longer a fixed identity or a collection of thoughts and emotions, but the immutable consciousness that observes all of this. And this consciousness is our true nature. This realization can completely change the way we deal with life. When we identify with the ego, we constantly react to the ups and downs of circumstances, trapped in a narrative of success and failure, pleasure and pain, control and fear. Each situation, each interaction, is filtered through this limited identity, making us believe that we need to fight, to maintain control, to defend who we are, to avoid pain and seek pleasure. However, by realizing that we are the consciousness that observes these processes, our relationship with the world and with ourselves begins to radically change. Pure consciousness, in its essence, has no attachment to identity, suffering, or the need for control. It simply observes. And when we connect with this consciousness, we realize that suffering is not an intrinsic part of who we are. Suffering occurs when we identify with the ego and its emotional reactions. But when we recognize that we are the consciousness that observes suffering, we see that it, just like thoughts and emotions, is temporary. Suffering comes and goes, but we remain unchanged, distant from its influence. True freedom arises when we detach from the need to control or define our experience. This comes from simply being present, observing everything that arises without losing ourselves in the mind's identifications. This freedom is not something we achieve once, but something that expands as we practice awakening to pure consciousness in our daily lives. The constant practice of returning to this consciousness, of observing without engaging with the stories of the mind, creates a new way of living. Each moment becomes an opportunity to connect with what we truly are, pure consciousness, which is not limited by the past or the future, but exists fully in the present. And by doing this, we can live with more peace, clarity, and authenticity as we are free from the traps of the ego. So, connecting with pure consciousness is the key to transformation. This does not mean escaping life or its emotions, but learning to observe them with a new perspective, without identification, without judgment, simply witnessing what is. This practice, when incorporated into daily life, brings a freedom that transcends any situation or challenge, for we are no longer prisoners of the fluctuations of the mind, but the immutable consciousness that observes everything with serenity and clarity. Thank you for embarking on this journey with me. If this video resonated with you, I invite you to like and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others so they can benefit from this message. And don't forget to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, reflections, and experiences. Thanks again for watching and for joining me. Take care and see you soon.